Are you looking for a new job or interested in leveling up? Job Search Radio is your go-to resource for insider tips on job hunting and growing your career. Here's your host, Jeff Altman.
Hi, this is Jeff Altman, the Big Game Hunter, and you're listening to Job Search Radio. You know, I've been a professional recruiter for a long, long time, and one thing I know is everything works in job hunting. I don't care what the experts say, everything works. However, there are some things that work better than others at given times. So I decided I would bring on someone to talk with you about the things that are working best now in job search. Kathy Simmons is the head of Netshare. And Kathy, would you please introduce yourself and your firm to my audience, please?
Certainly. Again, I'm Kathy Simmons. I'm the CEO of Netshare. Netshare has been around since 1991. We've been connecting executives primarily with jobs, with information resources, and with each other. We are a professional network that is committed to providing private and a professional environment where members are treated as individuals and not data points.
Thank goodness. Thank goodness about that lastly. So, you know, you're dealing with an executive clientele. I'm sure a lot of the lessons that you have from that experience work with non-executives as well. And just so my audience is clear, when you say an executive clientele, C-suite, VP, how far down the ladder do you tend to cover?
We go for everything from C-suite, down to, I would say, at the manager level. Some individual contributor, but primarily professional career type. It might be an accountant, an attorney, something like that, where they're doing an individual contributor role.
Thank you. And that's a huge territory, folks. So she's got a great perspective on this. So let me just start by asking you, Kathy, what isn't working as well these days?
Well, what isn't working as well today is the same thing that didn't work as well for the last 10 or 15 years. The idea that you don't have to take responsibility for this, and what happens is that people will confuse being busy with being productive. Interesting.
So when you're talking about being busy, what are you referring to?
Well, when I first started with Netshare and we first went online, oftentimes people would talk about how they had applied to 100 jobs in there, thought they were doing great on their job search, and they'd done it all in the morning and hadn't even gotten out of their pajamas. And that's great, but I cannot believe that applying for 100 jobs is more than being busy as opposed to being productive. Today, what happens is that people have either the idea that if I go on LinkedIn and I connect to 100 people and I get all of this out there, that I'm networking. Well, it's not the same thing. There's a big difference between being busy and sending out endorsements and sending out all of these things and really networking and developing relationships that help you get that next opportunity.
And sending out those 100 resumes, this is something I wrote about on LinkedIn recently, about the amount of spam that people send out when they're submitting resumes. I get so many resumes every morning from people who in no way, shape, or form are qualified for the positions that they're applying for. But they want to do the job.
Mm-hmm.
And they're just sending those resumes out, and that's in there with those 100 that they sent out before noon, and all they're doing is wasting their time and everyone else's time. It's awful.
Absolutely. There's, and it makes it very hard for people to be able to cut through the noise, and when they are qualified, because you're doing this without putting any thought into it, and that brings me to sort of what I try and instill in Netshare members, is the idea that there's there's both what I call the proactive approach to job search and the reactive approach to job search. And the way I define those is when you're in a job search, it's almost as though you're launching a product or you're starting a new company. And you're the new company, you're the new product, you're what's going to market. Well, the first thing you have to understand, obviously, is what you bring to the table, what makes you unique. And then the next thing is, who's that market? At what point to use the marketing metaphor, do your features become benefits to that person? So again, coming back to what you're saying, the idea that really pay attention to what you're sending out. If you're not a match for what you're sending out, you're wasting everybody's time. So once you understand who it is what your sweet spot is and who you need to be in touch with, then the next piece is just understanding, how do I best get in touch with them? Is it responding to a job position? Is it reaching out on LinkedIn? Is it going to my personal network? All of those things are different ways. It's sort of thinking, what channel is the best way for me to get in touch with the market?
So what you're saying is what's working best is the proactive job search rather than the reactive one. Folks, the reactive one is, I see an ad online, I'm going to reply to it. So the proactive one is most effective for your members is what I'm hearing you say.
Absolutely. I think, both of them, I wouldn't say I think many people come to Netshare because we post job leads, obviously, and that's why we have a network of recruiters and companies that use us. But understanding that while you are responding to positions that are out there, you also need to be doing some of the work of deciding, okay, here's 10 companies I'm really interested in. How do I get in touch with those companies? What's the best way for me to make a connection and try and build a relationship with that company so they understand what I bring to the table that will help them?
So I have a hunch that your best way doesn't involve an applicant tracking system.
Well, I think I've been having a lot of conversations recently about applicant tracking systems and the sort of the idea that we can look at human beings quite in the same way that we do buying a blender. So, for example, if you look at Amazon and it says people who bought this blender also looked at these blenders or that type of thing, it's not exactly the same thing as, let's say, not to pick on LinkedIn, but you notice that if you're on LinkedIn, it'll say people who looked at this profile also looked at this profile. Well, it doesn't quite compute the same way in hiring. And the problem with applicant tracking systems is that when you send a resume and it goes into the applicant tracking system, a lot of it is, obviously it's controlled by certain algorithms or certain programs that they've run. They may have weighted the preference for a certain academic background or certain skills that they value over others, and that's great. But it isn't always the most efficient way, certainly at a more senior level. If you're talking about straight technical skills, can they do the job? And because they know how to do Java or they know how to do Ruby on Rails, that's a great screening tool to at least begin to start it. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to make a hire out of it.
I agree. And using those two examples of the tech skills, the Ruby person will never apply for a job through an applicant tracking system. And the Java person will make the mistake of doing that because they've been conditioned that way. For the executive clientele, it's the worst thing in the world to do. You are being funneled through a sausage maker. And the sausage maker has been programmed to look at stuff in a particular way. And unless you format your resume, I'm not talking about how the page lays out, unless the particular phrasing is used identically in your resume to how it's been programmed in the ATS, applicant tracking system, you may get rejected even though you've spent 7 years working with exactly what they want to do. It's so frustrating for so many people.
Absolutely. And one of the, I'll give you an example with a Netshare member. They had applied to something through it, and it actually had gone through the company's applicant tracking system, because many companies require it because of compliance and things like that. And the person never heard back. And I looked at his resume and the company, and I said, this is a perfect fit. I don't understand that. So what I was able to do is call and speak to the hiring person and say, you realize that they're, here's this. Have you really taken a look at this resume? And it turned out that they had that the ATS had totally misunderstood exactly what you were saying. There was a mismatch in the terminology that was used, and once that happened, that person ended up getting the job. So it's a interesting dilemma. I mean, when we're trying to we're concerned about compliance and making the job hiring system more efficient, are we in fact making it much more difficult to attract or to select the right candidates?
I believe we are, and I want to come back to that in just a moment. But first, my job search insider tip for the show, which is about interviewing. Years ago, an old client of mine called up, and he had a problem. He had been on a bunch of interviews and was turned down consistently. 15 interviews, all rejections. First interviews, never got to a second. So he apologized for not having contacted me earlier and asked for a consult with me. So I invited him to my place, and we sat down and talked, and I did a mock interview with him. By the time he answered the second question, I had my answer as to what the problem was. He had been hearing the same questions over and over again, repeatedly for 15 interviews, and his answers had become stale. They sounded boring. They sounded rehearsed. They sounded tired. The idea that you have to remember is every interview is a fresh experience. There's a new audience in the seats of the theater that night listening to your play. I always remember years ago seeing the play Cats on Broadway, and every night the cast is singing those same songs over and over again. 8 performances a week, 6 days a week, the same lines, the same music, and yet they made it seem fresh every night. You have to remember doing that in order to avoid getting stale. You have to prepare yourself in such a way that you never wind up being like John was in that story. So let's come back to Kathy Simmons and continue our conversation. And I'm going to pick up the baton here because I left everyone hanging with a thought. And that is, with applicant tracking systems, there's one other problem with them that most people don't know. And that is the misuse of them by many institutions in claiming ownership of your candidacy. And by that I mean, when an individual applies to the applicant tracking system, they're now a data point for that organization forever. Years later, you apply for a job or have a recruiter submit a resume for a position that they know your background fits for. And at the end of the day, what winds up happening way too often is firms respond by saying, we know that person. We already know them. And you don't get the interview. And worse than that, you don't even get the phone call because the HR people in that organization are just way too busy to pick up a phone and call you to follow up. So ATSs are clearly, if you can avoid them as an entry point into an organization, clearly avoid them because that situation I just described goes on forever. Forever. It's awful. So continuing on, Kathy, you're suggesting that contacting who within an organization is the ideal person to wind up getting your entry point?
Well, I think it obviously depends on the level you're going in. I don't, and no disrespect to HR, they are usually overworked in in most companies and are taught to. They're looking more at how to screen people out than to how to include them. And what I think happens is if you can get to someone who is, it doesn't have to necessarily be the person you're going to report into. It might be a peer, someone who would eventually be a peer in your role, and have a real conversation where it's, and again, you want to have it on that sort of peer-to-peer type of conversation where you talk about, tell me a little bit about, it's not quite an informational interview, but it's more, tell me about what's going on in the company. Let me know a little, give me some thoughts about what's working, what's not working. And if you can get that kind of conversation with someone and you treat it almost as though it were a consulting opportunity, a way to say, well, what we've done in XYZ company is we did this, this is how I've worked in different things. Pretty soon you find that you're reaching that, you will either find that there's no fit there, there's no rapport, you're not in it, it's not going to work for you, or you'll find that, you actually are again, not that data point, but a human being with skills, because we all know that it's not just the hard skills, it's the soft skills, and it's the ability to communicate and to fit into a culture that makes a successful hire. And so having those kind of conversations with people are far more effective than simply, either post and pray or send and pray that it will get through to the right person.
Folks, if you're not familiar with that post and pray and send and pray term, post your resume to a job board, pray that someone sees it and actually contacts you. I think you can figure out what send and pray is. So in contacting this individual who might be a peer, I find it's rare that I get through to people on my first attempt. So leaving a message for someone or sending an email or perhaps even an in-mail on LinkedIn. Let's say it's a voice message. What might someone leave in the way of a voicemail message to try and get a call back?
Well, I think it's there. You can do it that way, and that's essentially kind of a cold call, which is you can't. I've had Netshare members that have been successful doing that. If it's I would say as far as the message goes, when you're trying to get a conversation with somebody, and in this case, it's not necessarily because they have an open position. It's because you see that there's an opportunity there. You might, in your voicemail message, say, hey, John, I would really like to talk to you about some specific issue that you think that company is having, or a specific type of project that they might be working on that you're working on or you have worked on in the past. And just get some ideas, just have some, if you have a few moments, love to talk to you about it. And that will usually get some kind of a response. You don't want to come across as you're going to sell them a solution, as in a software solution or something like that. But it's more of that type. But what I think is even more effective, is obviously if you can find a connection. And again, this is not I ask my LinkedIn connection necessarily to introduce me, but if you can, that's a great start. But if you have a connection in your network that, moving back a step, let's say you've determined that these 3 companies are of interest to you. So you've gone to your network and said, I'm really interested in these 3 companies. Do you know of anybody in your network that I should be talking to? So at which point, let's say one of a good networking connection, someone that you know fairly well, says, Yeah, I do. I know John over at ABC Company. I'd be happy to make an introduction to you. One of the first things you do is find out in what context they know them. Is that person just a client? Is it a casual acquaintance? Because, obviously on LinkedIn, many of us have connections that we don't have a real relationship with. So there's a difference. So you want to understand the relationship. If that person really does have a relationship with the person that you're trying to reach, then they're going to take your call. So that's the secret. There's a little bit of legwork involved. It's not simply, again, it comes back to when we talk about what works and what doesn't work in job search, it's the same as what works in life. It's not transactional. It's about relationships. It's about everything spins on relationships. What kind of relationship you have with this person? What kind of relationship do they have with this person? And so what you're trying to do is not create a one-off transactional experience, but something where you're actually building a relationship with that person.
So true, Kathy. Facebook has built their entire business around the idea of, people have relationships with others, and we want to be the framework where that relationship exists. And while they're there engaged with one another, we have some information about products that may be attractive to you that we'd like to sell to you. As a matter of fact, your friend Victor over here gave a thumb up to this particular blender, to use that example from earlier. Or you go to Amazon, and the idea of the analytics that present the alternatives that people looked at is the same model. So, yes, it is so important to take the time to develop the relationship with folks so that when they provide an introduction, it has meaning to you and has value for them as well. One other quick side note. Before we started doing this show, I got a message from someone who I had on as a guest named Ron Nash. He was on a couple of months ago talking about LinkedIn. And he sent me a message saying there was someone in a class that I just finished teaching who wanted to speak with you about job hunting over the age of 50. Ron was a terrific guest. Did I contact this person immediately? You bet. You bet. So having that trusted intermediary goes a long way, and that doesn't involve being transactional in your behavior.
Absolutely. I can't stress that enough in things, and that's how decisions get made. So much of it is when you go into an interview, to use your earlier discussion point where you were talking about interviewing skills. It's about the fit. It's about how. It's not just what your answers are. It's how you answer. Do you seem to have an enthusiasm? Do you have? Will I like you? Can we build a relationship? It's again that relationship piece comes in. It's not just right and wrong answers. It's whether or not I feel any kind of commonality with you. Or, I have a friend who talks about the three questions are: can you do the job? Like doing the job? Will I like you when you're doing the job? Those are the three things going on in the interview. So it's coming back to this again. It's all about that relationship piece.
So right. When firms invite you in for an interview, they've already done one basic assessment. On paper, do you look like you have a background that fits? Have you worked in an organization of a similar size and scope to theirs where superficially you would fit? But remember, they've done the same thing with 5 other people, let's say. Why do they choose you? What's the reason you can give them to choose you? Because the fact of the matter is, I am sure that at least 3 of those others are competent too. So you've got to give them some sort of emotional reason, some interpersonal reason that causes them to choose you, which includes your self-confidence, how you demonstrate character, maybe a little charisma. Charismatic people always do better than non-charismatic people. Those factors that translate into personal leadership, the qualities that make you unique. And frankly, I've been encouraging people that instead of playing it safe on interviews and being nice and polite, to bet the farm, to go for broke on these interviews instead of holding back. Because I just find so many applicants don't really display their real gifts when they're trying to be nice and professional and polite, that they really have to go out there and be full and rich in front of the person who's interviewing them. Do you see similar things where people are holding back a little bit too much?
I think so. I think they're both extremes. There are people who don't hold back enough. But what I think that it's important to remember in an interview as well is that it's about finding that fit. It's as much about you interviewing them as they are interviewing you. Can you relate to this person? And I think it's people, and interviews are stressful, no question about it. And I think most people have this sense that I've got to answer all the questions in the right way, and I don't, and I'm going to say this in the way what I think they want to hear. But you're really not doing either of you a service when you're interviewing that way. It's really about finding that, am I going to like working here? Are you going to like having me work here? And can we, is it something that meets both of our objectives? And so I think that's an important thing. And that's why I was talking about earlier a little bit is almost think about it as though you were a consultant coming in to help them. Not that you want to give them so much advice that they feel like you're being a know-it-all, but listen to where their pain points are and talk to them about that. Understand those kinds of things so you're having a real conversation and you're engaging each other.
I can't agree with you more. When I coach people about interviewing, the first thing I use is that model of the consultant. The consultant doesn't arrive telling the potential client, let me tell you everything I can do for you. They try to identify what the pain points are, what the issues are, and then try to address the needs, wants, and desires of the potential customer. In interviewing, I encourage people to start off the interview by thanking them for making time and then just simply saying, I've reviewed the position description, some very interesting points, but I want to get your take on the role. Are there things that are not in the job description, or could you give me a sense of the position as it stands now and what I could be doing to help? So as to elicit information that you can address in the course of the interview as early as possible, instead of waiting for them to say, so do you have any questions for us? And then asking about the job.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing, too, is, the way that you can kind of do that makes it also a little more active listen. You want to listen. One of the things that's difficult in an interview is because you start, when the person is talking, you're already formulating your answer. And so that can be, you're not necessarily hearing them. So I think, really listening to the question, giving your answer, and then maybe checking in and saying, did I answer the question? Do you have any other questions about that? And, again, that kind of promotes that back and forth that can make it a real conversation as opposed to, just somebody sitting there checking off boxes.
We are in complete agreement. Interviews need to be interactive, and if they're one person doing a soliloquy, unfortunately the other person starts thinking about what they have to do after this interview instead of listening to you. So,
do you ever, and I have a question for you, do you ever, at the end of an interview, when you're coaching on interviewing, do you ever suggest that they ask, it's a gutsy question, and I don't know how I feel about it, but to say something, do you have any concerns about me as a candidate? Are there any other questions I can answer for you?
I language it a little bit differently, but the theme is still the same. Is there anything that we haven't covered here that you would need in order to evaluate me completely? Any reasons to have cause for pause about next steps with me? So that in this way they have an opportunity to raise the subject, because way too often, questions have been asked in such a way that they haven't drawn out that answer. Mm-hmm. So often firms will ask questions and go through the checklist, and the questions were never quite framed well enough to elicit that information. So yes, I do encourage people to do that. And then say, what would next steps look like? When might I hear from you about the next step in the process? Well, we'd have a decision by Thursday. So would it be okay if I contacted you by next Tuesday if I haven't heard anything?
Absolutely.
And that sets an expectation about follow-up from you if for some reason they don't keep their commitment.
And I think the other thing, too, that you can judge is if you say that sometimes, and there's a hesitancy, you can tell how if they're fairly quick about saying, yes, that's fine, be happy to have you follow up with me. If there's a little bit of a pause, sometimes that can be an indicator about how well the interview went.
One of my other signals about how well the interview went is there's a certain point in the third part of an interview where they spend some more time talking to you than asking you questions. And my experience is the more they talk, the more they like you. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I always tell people that's because again, it's like when you're on a date. And you're trying, unless it's just nervous chatter, but when you're on a date, if you're actually talking to each other, or you're hearing that kind of a first date, you're hearing that kind of conversation, then there's a good chance there's a good rapport there.
Absolutely. So far, the big takeaway for everyone is proactive job search works far better than reactive job search, and that there are ways to be proactive that you've covered in this interview that are more effective than other ways. Is there anything else that you'd like to offer our listeners that will be helpful to them with knowing what works and what doesn't?
I think it's just probably that you need to own your career. Whether it's, and by that I mean, I'm old enough to remember when career planning was actually done by the company, and the company looked at how long you were going to be, what the next steps were, what the career progression was in the company, and that type of thing. That doesn't really happen anymore. I mean, people aren't spending 20 years with the same company the way they used to. You need to, whether you're employed or whether you're looking for you're out looking for that next job, you need to understand that you're the one that has to do this. And it's work. In some cases, this is your job. Owning this career and owning this job search is your job. And you have to treat it like a job. Doesn't mean you don't get time off, but just like a regular job, but you need to understand that nobody's going to do this for you.
And folks, you have to constantly, even when you're working and doing a great job, you must constantly be building your network and building your brand/reputation. So that in this way, even if it's within your current firm, you're already thinking in terms of what's my next career move? What's the next opportunity I want to get to? And how can I best get there? What do I need to learn, know? Who do I need to know in order to make that next step? Because as you said so well, the idea of career planning doesn't exist. Unfortunately, there's a time in this country where there is now disposable talent, and we've all seen how quickly it gets disposed of. Kathy, this has been terrific. How can people reach you or find out more about Netshare?
Well, the easiest way is to come to our website, which is www.netshare.com. Also, check me out on LinkedIn. It's Kathy Simmons. And if you hear this and me a note asking me to connect, please feel free to do so. And make it nice and easy, my email is really simple. It's just Kathy, Kathy, @netshare.com. And if you have questions or anything I can help with, feel free to drop me an email, and we'll set up a time to talk.
Super. Thank you. Folks, we'll be back again soon with more job search advice for you. I'm Jeff Altman, the Big Game Hunter, and I want to encourage you to come over to my website, which is thebiggamehunter.us. I've got a ton of content there that you can watch, listen to, or read that will help you find work more quickly. And as well, send me a connection request. My address is linkedin.com/IN/The Big Game Hunter. Be happy to accept a connection request for you and forward requests for you to other people who are in my network. This is Jeff Altman. Hope you enjoyed today's show. Take care.
For more job search advice, visit Jeff's website at thebiggamehunter.us. That's thebiggamehunter.us.